33,000 feet above the Sea of Japan, the world turned thin, silent, and utterly hostile to human life. Inside the pressurized cabin of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, Technical Sergeant William "Red" Hanley checked the oxygen gauge again. It wavered between green and red, trembling like a heartbeat. The temperature outside was -50 degrees Fahrenheit. The skin of the aircraft creaked under pressure differentials, rivets clicking softly in the cold. Hanley tugged at his mask strap, adjusting the rubber seal against his cheek. It hissed faintly, a ghostly rhythm that mixed with the drone of 4 Wright R-3350 engines. Beyond the plexiglass nose, Japan's coast was a faint blur beneath scattered clouds. To the crew, it might as well have been another planet. For most of human history, men weren't meant to exist here. Above 30,000 feet, the air contains barely half the oxygen of sea level. Unprotected, a man loses consciousness within seconds. At 33,000, he's dead within 2 minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Yet here they were 10 men in a metal tube, living only because a chemist no one remembered had found a way to make fire breathe in a vacuum. Hanley didn't know his name. None of them did. They just knew the oxygen smelled faintly sweet, almost metallic, and that if the wrong valve jammed, it could turn the bomber into a flying bomb. It had happened before. In training, an entire crew from the 504th Bomb Group had vanished over Kansas after a pre-flight test. The official report blamed oxygen system ignition. In plainer terms, the air inside their B-29 had exploded. By the winter of 1944, the Army Air Forces had quietly ordered changes to every oxygen system line, valve, and chemical mixture. But those revisions didn't erase the fact that every crew flying above 30,000 feet was trusting their lives to chemistry that could kill them without warning. The irony was that this same chemistry, the dangerous oxygen mix, was what made the B-29 untouchable. The American war machine had always been obsessed with altitude. In 1942, as B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds hammered occupied Europe, planners in Washington and Dayton were already imagining something higher, faster, and deadlier, an aircraft that could fly above the reach of flak, out of range of fighters, and strike deep inside the Japanese home islands. The Boeing Model 345, which would become the B-29, was the answer. It was the most complex combat aircraft ever built, a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, computerized sighting systems, and an operational ceiling above 30,000 feet. But altitude came at a biological cost. Pilots could handle 20,000 feet with a simple constant-flow oxygen mask, the same type used in B-17 seconds. Above that, though, the human body's metabolism changed. The partial pressure of oxygen dropped so low that even a mask couldn't compensate. The only solution was to pressurize the cabin or to feed pure oxygen in carefully metered doses, blended to maintain physiological balance. In 1943, a small group of chemists at Wright Field and the Air Materiel Command began experimenting with liquid oxygen systems that could sustain long-duration, high-altitude flight. The lead chemist was Dr. Robert J. Millikan, not the Nobel laureate, but his nephew, a quiet Illinois-born researcher who had worked on cryogenic gases before the war. His challenge was brutally simple on paper and nearly suicidal in practice: make oxygen portable, stable, and pure enough to keep men alive for 16-hour missions, yet not so volatile that a static spark would turn it into a firestorm. Millikan's team built what they called a dual-phase oxygen supply. Instead of relying on heavy gas cylinders, the B-29 carried a cryogenic tank that stored oxygen as a liquid at -297 degrees Fahrenheit. When the crew needed it, the liquid evaporated into gas and was metered through a regulator. The idea was brilliant and deadly. Liquid oxygen is an aggressive oxidizer. In contact with oil, grease, or certain metals, it can detonate. Early prototypes exploded without warning. During bench testing at Wright Field in March 1943, an entire workbench disappeared when a valve contaminated with hydraulic fluid ignited. The explosion killed one technician and severely burned two others. Millikan was shaken but refused to abandon the design. He argued that the hazard wasn't in the chemistry itself, but in human contamination, dust, oil, fingerprints. "Oxygen is safe," he told the review board, "only if we remember that it is never harmless." By mid-1944, every B-29 rolling out of Boeing's Wichita and Renton plants carried Millikan's liquid oxygen system. It allowed crews to breathe comfortably at altitudes where most Japanese fighters couldn't climb. The bomber's pressurized fuselage reduced fatigue, while the oxygen ensured alertness. Missions that had once drained men to the edge of collapse could now last 14 hours. Yet, even as the new system made the Superfortress the most formidable weapon in the Pacific, it carried a secret the Air Force never advertised. If a single leak developed, liquid oxygen could saturate fabric, gloves, or even a man's clothing. The slightest spark, a static discharge, an electrical short could cause spontaneous combustion. In one case, during a maintenance check at Easley Field on Saipan, a crew chief accidentally spilled a few ounces of liquid oxygen on the tarmac. His wrench slipped, struck a rock, and the resulting spark engulfed the entire ground crew in a sheet of blue flame. The incident was officially described as fuel mishandling. In truth, it was chemistry doing exactly what chemistry does, magnifying oxygen's hunger for fire. To most air crews, the details were academic. They knew only that when the oxygen stopped, so did life. On long missions to Nagoya, Osaka, or Tokyo, they monitored the gauges like sacred relics. The navigator's log included oxygen pressure readings every 15 minutes. The radio operator carried spare masks in sealed metal tins. Every man aboard the B-29 learned to trust a system that terrified the scientists who built it. By the time the 509th Composite Group trained in New Mexico for its atomic mission, the oxygen system had become invisible, a background hum in the machinery of total war. No one questioned it anymore. The B-29's ability to fly untouchable above 33,000 feet owed as much to Millikan's dangerous chemistry as to Boeing's engineering or LeMay's tactics. At those altitudes, Japanese anti-aircraft shells burst harmlessly, thousands of feet below. Intercepting fighters, their engines starved for air, could barely climb within firing range before stalling. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. From the ground, the Superfortress looked like a silver star, drifting across the stratosphere invincible, godlike, and utterly detached from the burning cities beneath it. The irony, of course, was that every one of those bombers carried within it a hidden explosive potential, a thin film of liquid oxygen waiting to meet a spark. And somewhere in Illinois, Dr. Robert Millikan read the casualty reports, some labelled oxygen malfunction, others loss of aircraft, cause undetermined, and understood that his invention had succeeded in making the impossible possible. It had also made survival a matter of luck. By the autumn of 1944, with the B-29 campaign escalating, the Air Materiel Command finally confronted the paradox. Crews were flying higher and safer from enemy fire, but their machines were dying from within. Oxygen leaks, pressure regulator failures, and spontaneous fires were claiming more bombers than enemy action. A classified report dated October 3, 1944, summarized it with bureaucratic precision. The operational benefit of high-altitude oxygen systems is offset by unacceptable maintenance and safety risks. However, removal is impractical due to physiological necessity. It was the kind of sentence that sealed fates without emotion. In late November 1944, a strange pattern began appearing in the mission logs of the 73rd Bomb Wing based on Saipan. B-29 seconds were returning with their oxygen gauges cracked, their regulators frozen solid, and in some cases, their fuselage interiors scorched by sudden, unexplained fires. At first, maintenance crews blamed electrical faults. The Superfortress was a flying labyrinth of wiring nearly 10 miles of copper cable connecting pressurization valves, gun turrets, and oxygen lines. But the more they examined the wreckage, the less sense it made. In one report, a B-29 named Lucky Lady had been cruising at 31,000 feet when the co-pilot's oxygen mask caught fire. The crew extinguished it within seconds, but the flame left a blackened trail across the cabin insulation. Another aircraft, Pacific Queen, vanished on its return from Nagoya. Debris recovered weeks later showed burn marks concentrated around the oxygen manifold, a detail quietly redacted from the final report. The accidents were too scattered to form a clear pattern, yet too similar to ignore. It wasn't combat that was killing these bombers. It was chemistry. At Wright Field, Dr. Robert Millikan stared at the photographs sent from the Pacific charred fittings, melted regulators, oxygen tanks twisted open like flowers. His invention had passed every controlled test, but the battlefield was not controlled. Every long mission from Saipan to Tokyo demanded that the system perform flawlessly for 16 hours straight. That meant temperature extremes, pressure cycles, vibrations, and human error multiplied across thousands of flight hours. The liquid oxygen boiled inside its tanks, venting gaseous vapor through relief valves that often froze shut. When that happened, pressure spiked. The tanks ruptured like grenades. To a ground crew, it looked like spontaneous combustion. To Millikan, it was predictable. He wrote a memo in December 1944 that few people ever read. Every solution in chemistry is a trade with nature. We've traded flak for oxygen. But even he didn't realize how close that trade came to erasing entire crews. On January 19, 1945, the crew of Dynamite, a B-29 from the 498th Bomb Group, prepared for a night raid over Kobe. The mission brief was routine: climb to 32,000 feet, bomb from altitude, and return before dawn. The weather was clear, tailwinds, strong, perfect flying conditions. Captain Raymond Holden, the pilot, made his usual cockpit joke as he adjusted his mask. "Gentlemen, breathe deep. This is the purest air you'll ever get." It wasn't far from the truth. The oxygen feeding into their masks was over 99% pure industrial perfection that would have been impossible before the war. Holden's co-pilot, Lieutenant Grady, ran through the checklist. Cabin pressure nominal, oxygen flow stable, all indicators green. An hour after takeoff, somewhere north of Iwo Jima, a faint hissing sound broke the calm. Grady traced it to a valve beneath his seat. The gauge needle trembled. Before he could reach for the shutoff, a white frost began forming around the fittings. Liquid oxygen had started to leak. The temperature of the escaping gas was so low it flash froze the rubber seal, then supercooled the surrounding metal. Grady called it in, "We've got a leak, small one," but the words never finished. The frost turned to vapor, and the vapor met a spark from the instrument panel. The explosion ripped through the cockpit like lightning. Holden was thrown backward, half blinded. Grady vanished. The windshield fractured, air howled through the opening, and flames clawed at the cabin walls. The navigator, dazed, scrambled for the emergency mask as the oxygen lines fed the fire with invisible fury. At 30,000 feet, fire behaves differently. It doesn't billow, it dances. The flames burned clean and blue, feeding on the oxygen that was supposed to sustain them. Holden somehow regained control. With the forward turret destroyed and both pilots burned, Dynamite turned back toward Saipan. She barely made it. The bomber crash-landed on arrival, the front half reduced to molten alloy. The crew's report ran 10 pages, most of it describing what couldn't be explained, how a simple leak could turn air into fire. Millikan read that report too. He never forgot the line the crew chief wrote at the end: "It wasn't the enemy, it was our own air that tried to kill us." By early 1945, The Army Air Forces could no longer ignore the pattern. A classified technical order went out across all Pacific bomber bases. TO-0160JE5, Oxygen System Handling Procedures. It read less like an instruction manual and more like a warning. No smoking, open flame, or electrical discharge within 50 feet of oxygen equipment. Personnel must wear lint-free gloves and avoid contact with oil or grease. In the event of liquid spill, allow full vaporization before re-entry. The final line was the most chilling. Oxygen, though life-sustaining, shall be regarded as an explosive hazard. Crews joked darkly that their bombers carried not one bomb load, but two, the one in the bay and the one in the air they breathed. Still, the missions continued. General Curtis LeMay had taken command of XXI Bomber Command and was determined to break Japan's industrial backbone before invasion. When he shifted tactics in March 1945 to low-altitude night incendiary raids, many assumed the change was purely strategic, a way to burn the wooden cities of Tokyo more efficiently. But the men who'd seen the oxygen accidents whispered another reason. At lower altitudes, they didn't have to rely on the high-pressure oxygen system. The air was thicker, the danger was lower. The bombers could carry more fuel, more bombs, and less fear of their own machinery. It was a quiet, unofficial relief. LeMay never mentioned oxygen in his memos, but his flight engineers knew the truth. The shift to night raids at 7,000 or 8,000 feet effectively removed one of the B-29's most fatal vulnerabilities. Ironically, the aircraft designed to conquer the stratosphere did its deadliest work crawling just above the clouds. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Millikan's team at Wright Field began developing what they called Oxygen System Mark II, a safer, self-contained design using chemical oxygen generators instead of liquid storage. These generators used sodium chlorate and iron powder to release breathable oxygen when heated, a system similar to those later used in submarines and spacecraft. It was stable, compact, and nearly immune to explosion. But it came too late for the crews already flying. Millikan, racked with guilt, personally wrote to the families of two technicians killed in a 1945 test explosion. His letters were apologetic but clinical. "Your son died advancing a technology that preserved countless others. His sacrifice was not in vain. He meant it, but the words rang hollow. He had built a machine to give men breath, and it had often taken it away." As the war neared its end, the liquid oxygen system quietly disappeared from future designs. The B-50, B-36, and later B-47 all used improved, safer variants, but the official manuals never mentioned their wartime predecessor. The B-29's dangerous oxygen mix was erased from the heroic narrative of the air war, its name buried in technical archives. Yet the system's legacy endured in another form. The knowledge gained from those perilous experiments became the foundation of post-war aerospace medicine. The same cryogenic principles that once threatened to destroy bombers made possible the first pressurized jetliners and, eventually, the life support systems of early space capsules. When Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in 1947, the oxygen flowing into his mask was derived from Millikan's work. When John Glenn orbited Earth in 1962, the oxygen in his capsule came from an evolved version of the same chemical system once feared by B-29 crews. From fire came flight, but for the men who lived through those missions, the irony was bitter. They had flown untouchable, high above the enemy, yet many knew their deadliest threat was invisible, silent, and self-inflicted. Veterans' memoirs from the 20th Air Force rarely mention oxygen systems, but when they do, it's with a mix of awe and dread. One engineer recalled, "Every time I put on the mask, I wondered if I was breathing safety or a spark away from dying. You learn to stop thinking about it." Another wrote, "At 33,000 feet, you don't feel like a man. You feel like part of the airplane. You're alive only because some chemist in Ohio got his math right." That was Millikan's true legacy, not in blueprints or patents, but in the uneasy coexistence between human fragility and mechanical perfection. He had given them life in a place where life shouldn't exist, but he had also proven that survival, at that altitude, was never free. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the B-29 had flown over 32,000 sorties. Of those, more than 200 were lost to non-combat mechanical failures. A quiet fraction of those still classified at the time were oxygen system incidents. When Millikan visited a surplus yard in Wichita after the war, he stood before the stripped fuselage of a retired Superfortress. The liquid oxygen tank was still there, dented, streaked with frost stains. A faint label read, "Handle with care life support." He reached out, ran his gloved hand over the metal, and murmured, "We gave them life in a bottle." No one heard him. No one wrote it down. But history remembers the paradox in other ways. The B-29 was the pinnacle of wartime engineering, a machine that could bring fire to cities an ocean away, that could fly beyond the reach of any defense. Yet its triumph depended on a chemistry so volatile that a single spark could undo it all. In that contradiction lies the quiet heart of 20th century warfare. The same intelligence that lifts men above the clouds also ensures they can fall faster than ever before. Dr. Millikan's dangerous oxygen mix was never meant to be heroic. It was meant to be practical. But like so many wartime innovations, its practicality was born from desperation, and its safety was learned through loss. Every engineer since has lived with that lesson. At 33,000 feet, there are no miracles, only physics, chemistry, and the fragile will to survive between them. When the war ended, the air over the Pacific finally fell silent. The last of the B-29 seconds returned home not to fanfare, but to storage yards and scrap yards, vast open fields where silver wings gleamed beneath Kansas sunlight. The crews dispersed, the engines cooled, and the oxygen systems that had kept them alive were quietly removed, drained, and classified as obsolete. But for Dr. Robert Millikan, the war didn't end in August 1945. It simply changed altitude. He was called to Washington that autumn, summoned to testify before a post-war engineering review board. Their purpose was to evaluate which wartime technologies could transition into peacetime aviation: radar, jet propulsion, pressurization, life support systems. Millikan sat before a semicircle of officers and engineers in uniform. His hair was thinner now, his voice quieter, his hands showing the faint tremor of a man who had spent years around cryogenic fluids. A colonel from the Air Technical Service Command asked the question that had haunted him since the war. "Doctor, given the number of oxygen-related incidents in the B-29 program, do you consider your system a success?" There was a pause long enough to measure by heartbeat. Millikan's eyes dropped to his hands. He thought of the reports, the frozen regulators, the burned crews, the aircraft that fell without warning into the Pacific. And then he thought of the other numbers. Tens of thousands of airmen who returned home alive because they could fly higher, safer, and longer than the enemy. When he finally spoke, his words were almost inaudible. "Success," he said, "is a question of altitude." The colonel frowned. Millikan continued, "At sea level, my system would be a failure. But 30,000 feet above the Earth, it's the only reason they could breathe. The cost of living up there is higher than most people realize." The room stayed silent. No one asked another question. The record of that testimony still exists, filed in a dusty corner of the National Archives under Cryogenic Breathing Apparatus, Model B-29. It was marked restricted, and for decades, that's where it stayed. The United States entered a new era of aviation almost immediately. The jet age came roaring out of the war's embers. Aircraft like the B-47 and the B-52 took shape on drawing boards that still smelled faintly of cordite and coffee. Designers at Boeing and Convair took the lessons of the Superfortress and turned them into the architecture of the Cold War. In that world, oxygen wasn't just a necessity, it was a weapon's companion. If a bomber could fly higher and longer than an interceptor, it won the war before the first shot. Millikan's system, or rather its safer descendants, became the foundation of modern high-altitude physiology. Engineers borrowed his vaporization principles for jet pressurization, his cryogenic containment methods for rocket oxidizers, and his regulator design for early space capsules. But Millikan never took credit. He had seen too many photographs. He retired quietly in 1950, taking a professorship at a small Midwestern college. His students remembered him as polite, precise, and strangely distant. He taught thermodynamics, but he never mentioned the war. Every spring, though, he made the same demonstration. He would fill a glass tube with liquid oxygen, dip a piece of wood into it, and then strike a match. The flame would erupt in brilliant white, too bright to stare at. The students gasped every time. Then he would extinguish it, pour the remaining liquid back into the flask, and say softly, "Fire and breath." The same element, depending on how you handle it. No one knew he was talking about the B-29. Across the Pacific, the legacy of those high-altitude raids had taken another form. Japan's cities, Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, lay in ruins. The same aircraft that had once frozen its crews in the stratosphere had burned entire metropolises from above. In Tokyo alone, over 100,000 civilians perished in one night in March 1945. The B-29's altitude advantage meant it could strike without warning, without interception. The Japanese air defense system couldn't reach that high. Historians would later call the B-29 the hand of inevitability. But for the men who flew it, the memory was more complicated. Pilot diaries recovered decades later show traces of guilt wrapped in irony. One reads, "We used the same oxygen to live that our bombs used to burn the city. Everything about that plane was designed for purity, pure air, pure power, pure destruction." They knew the war couldn't have been won without it. But they also knew that the difference between life and annihilation had been a single molecule, oxygen, giver and taker, sustainer and destroyer. In 1958, during the early planning for NASA's Mercury program, a small team of engineers visited retired scientists who had wartime experience with high-altitude oxygen systems. One of them was Millikan. They met in his modest laboratory, where he still kept the original glass model of the B-29 regulator assembly. When the NASA team described their new problem, how to supply breathable air to a capsule in orbit without risk of fire, Millikan gave them a long, quiet look. "You're still fighting the same war," he said, "only higher." He warned them about purity. Pure oxygen, he said, was a liar, it promised life, but carried death in its back pocket. His warning proved prophetic. 5 years later, in 1967, the Apollo 1 disaster killed 3 astronauts during a pre-flight test, when a spark ignited a cabin filled with 100% oxygen. The investigators who combed through the wreckage cited oxygen-enriched atmosphere, the primary cause. One of them, a young engineer, later found Millikan's 1944 memo buried in a file labeled B-29 system hazards. The first line read, "Pure oxygen is never harmless." The irony stretched across decades, as if the ghosts of B-29 seconds still whispered through the ducts of space capsules. Historians often call the B-29 the pinnacle of World War II aviation, a masterpiece of engineering, foresight, and industrial willpower. But hidden beneath that praise lies a quieter truth. Almost every innovation on that aircraft was a gamble. The pressurization, the engines, the radar sights, all were experimental, untested, and pushed beyond the safety margins known at the time. The oxygen system was simply the most dangerous of all, because its failure meant the immediate collapse of human biology. The B-29 lived on borrowed air. In that sense, it reflected the larger paradox of total war. The same ingenuity that saved lives also demanded them. Every advancement was purchased with an unseen cost, every breakthrough a balancing act between survival and sacrifice. Millikan's system was one such act, successful because it worked, tragic because it did. By the 1,970 seconds, most surviving B-29 seconds had been scrapped. A handful remained in museums, their interiors restored to gleaming condition. Visitors walked past them without noticing the small oxygen lines running along the bulkhead. At the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, one B-29 was restored to full pressurization. Technicians installed replica oxygen tanks identical to those designed by Millikan's wartime team. When they tested the system for the first time, a faint mist of vapor escaped from a valve. The engineers instinctively stepped back. Even 30 years later, that sound, the hiss of evaporating liquid oxygen, still carried memory. One of the restorers later said, "You could feel it in your spine. That noise killed people." It was a reminder that every piece of technology, no matter how benign in hindsight, carries the ghosts of its creation. Meanwhile, aviation medicine textbooks began to cite Millikan by name again. His early papers on cryogenic stability were rediscovered, his methods of thermal insulation and gas metering republished for the space age. His former students called him the forgotten architect of breathable air. But Millikan never published his memoirs. When he died in 1974, his papers contained only one handwritten note pinned to the final folder. The line between innovation and danger is measured in breath. That sentence could have been engraved on every B-29 cockpit in 1944. If you visit the B-29 Enola Gay today at the Smithsonian, you'll notice a polished placard describing its pressurization and oxygen systems. It lists specifications, tank capacity, flow rate, temperature tolerance, but omits the names of the people who built them. Nowhere does it say that the same system that kept Colonel Paul Tibbets alive as he dropped the atomic bomb over Hiroshima was designed by a chemist who warned it might explode. History tends to remember the big flash, not the quiet ignition. Yet in a way, that's the deeper legacy of the dangerous oxygen mix. It wasn't just a chemical breakthrough. It was a moral mirror. At 33,000 feet, the air is thin enough to make you believe you're untouchable. But the truth, one that Millikan understood, is that altitude doesn't erase consequence. It only delays it. The B-29's invulnerability came at the price of constant tension. Man's body against nature, invention against restraint, survival against the very elements that made it possible. Every hiss of oxygen through those lines was a reminder that life itself had become a controlled explosion. In one of his final lectures, Millikan told his students a story. He described standing on the flight line in 1944, watching a B-29 take off for its first high-altitude test. He had worried about the oxygen regulators, the pressure seals, the cold. As the bomber climbed into the blue, he felt pride and then dread. "It was beautiful," he said, "but I realized it was flying on the same principle as a candle. It burns as long as there's air." That line, like so many wartime truths, lived quietly in the footnotes. But it captures everything about that strange, deadly genius of the age, the relentless belief that human beings could master the elements, even if it meant becoming one with them. So what, then, was the real legacy of the chemist's dangerous oxygen mix? It wasn't just altitude, it wasn't just survival. It was the lesson that every great leap in technology carries a shadow, that the higher we fly, the thinner the line between innovation and catastrophe becomes. For the men who flew the B-29, that line ran right through the masks they wore, the hoses they checked, and the invisible air they trusted. For Millikan, it ran through his conscience, an unending calculation between what he made possible and what it cost. Today, modern aircraft and spacecraft still breathe echoes of that wartime chemistry. Every oxygen regulator on the International Space Station, every cryogenic tank on a launch pad, traces its lineage back to those early, desperate experiments at Wright Field. The safety standards, the purity thresholds, the redundant valves, all born from mistakes written in fire. Millikan's dangerous mix is now safe. But it's only safe because men once learned, at unbearable cost, how unsafe it could be. That's the irony that threads through every era of engineering. Progress doesn't erase danger. It teaches us how to live alongside it. As one surviving B-29 pilot put it in an interview years later, "We thought we were untouchable up there. But the truth is, the higher we went, the closer we got to the edge of what's human." He smiled, old hands trembling slightly, and added, "That Chemist, whoever he was, gave us air to breathe where there shouldn't have been any. That's a kind of godlike thing, but gods don't usually come out of laboratories." He paused. "And they sure don't sleep easy after." The story of the dangerous oxygen mix isn't just about technology or war. It's about the eternal bargain between necessity and risk, between the human desire to rise higher and the physical limits that remind us we're still made of flesh. The B-29 flew in that fragile space, balanced on the edge of science and survival, sustained by chemistry that could turn to flame at any moment. It soared, untouchable, for a few brief years. And then it fell back to Earth, leaving behind only silence, memory, and the thin, invisible trail of what it took to breathe among the stars. The summer of 1945 arrived heavy with humidity and a sense of inevitability. The Pacific War was a furnace consuming its last fuel. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, names that once shimmered with the romance of empire, were now scars of ash and glass. Above them drifted the silver ghosts of the B-29 seconds, following the invisible paths charted by the chemist's oxygen and the physicist's fire. In a hut near Wendover, Utah, Dr. Robert Millikan sat before a wire recorder, dictating the final report for the Air Materiel Command. His voice was thin and deliberate. "The liquid oxygen system has met all operational requirements, physiological safety within acceptable parameters. Recommendations for post-war aviation include additional filtration and static control mechanisms." He stopped, rewound, and listened to the playback. It was flawless bureaucratic language, every word designed to sound calm, professional, and harmless. Nowhere did it mention the burned crews, the exploded test benches, or the fact that several of the oxygen malfunctions had likely been full-system combustions. Those were buried in annexes that no one would read. Millikan reached for his pipe, remembered the lectures about static discharge, and set it back down. He smiled bitterly. Even now, surrounded by safety posters, he was afraid to light a match. Outside, the base hummed with rumors about something enormous being loaded into a modified B-29. The talk reached even the scientists' quarters, a bomb so powerful that it could end the war in a single blow. Millikan didn't ask questions. He already knew that war was simply a series of technical problems, waiting for the next genius to solve. On August 6th, a B-29 named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian at 2:45 a.m. Her oxygen tanks were topped off with Millikan's system purged, sealed, and double-checked. No one on board gave them a second thought. The crew had their minds on the bomb bay and the 10-foot cylinder resting inside. At 8:15 a.m., over Hiroshima, the bomb bay doors opened. A single silent chemical reaction. U-235 atoms, splitting apart, released energy that dwarfed everything mankind had known. The blast killed 80,000 people instantly. Millikan heard the news that evening on the radio. The announcer called it a revolutionary new weapon harnessing the power of the atom. The scientist listened in silence. Then he rose, went to his office window, and looked at the desert horizon fading into dusk. He wondered, briefly, If the men who designed that bomb had felt the same mixture of pride and dread that haunted him since the first B-29 flight. He had given men air where none existed. They had given fire where no one could escape it. Both inventions had made the stratosphere a stage for gods and turned the earth below into collateral. After the war, Millikan returned to Illinois. His work was classified for years, buried in the labyrinth of post-war aeromedical research. Commercial airliners soon adopted safer oxygen systems, filtered, buffered, and electronically regulated. But the principle remained his, a blend of chemistry and necessity. Every passenger, who sighed in comfort at 35,000 feet, was breathing the legacy of a weapon. He rarely spoke of the war. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who tended his garden and stared too long at the sky when jets passed overhead. Sometimes he would trace their vapor trails until they vanished, whispering something no one could hear. In 1953, a former B-29 crewman visited him unexpectedly. The man's name was Hanley, the same technical sergeant who had once checked the trembling oxygen gauge above Japan. He had tracked Millikan down after reading a declassified report. They shared coffee in the scientist's kitchen, the silence heavy with things both men didn't need to say. Hanley finally broke it. "You know, Doc, we always thought that oxygen smelled like metal, like blood and pennies. But up there, it smelled like safety, like we were beyond reach." Millikan nodded slowly. "It was never safe," he said, "just balanced on the edge of what we could control." Hanley smiled. "That's war, isn't it?" They both laughed, softly, the kind of laugh that carries more memory than humour. When Hanley left, Millikan watched his car disappear down the gravel road, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Someone had remembered not the explosions, not the statistics, but the fragile miracle that had kept men alive among the stars. In the Air Force archives, Millikan's final note still lies folded inside a leather binder. It reads, "Oxygen by itself is neither life nor death. It is the condition that makes both possible." That was his epitaph, though no one carved it in stone. And so the story of the dangerous oxygen mix born from chemistry, perfected in fear, and immortalized in flight, became another invisible thread woven into the tapestry of the 20th century. Every modern pilot who breathes above the clouds owes a debt to a man who understood both the gift and the peril of giving air to fire. For at 33,000 feet, where the world thins to silence and the engines hum like the heartbeat of creation, humanity still flies on the edge of combustion, alive only because someone dared to feed the sky a little more oxygen than it could handle. Decades later, the war had faded into documentary reels and anniversary speeches, yet the chemistry of flight still bore Millikan's fingerprints. Every cockpit, from the pressurized cabins of jetliners to the sleek helmets of astronauts, carried a variation of his principle: precision oxygen control under conditions hostile to life. What had once been a weapon system was now the quiet infrastructure of peace. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong's voice crackled through the vacuum from the surface of the moon, the life support telemetry scrolling across NASA's consoles looked familiar to anyone who had ever handled a B-29 manual. Liquid oxygen tanks, phase separators, pressure regulators, the same vocabulary Millikan's technicians had scribbled on chalkboards at Wright Field 26 years earlier. Humanity had finally escaped gravity's grasp using the same chemistry that once helped it destroy itself. For Millikan, long retired, the irony was no longer bitter. It was complete. He followed the Apollo missions obsessively, clipping newspaper articles and jotting notes in the margins. LOX utilization efficiency equals 92%. Remarkable stability. He saw, in those silent columns of numbers, the redemption of a dangerous idea. The substance that had once ignited bombers now carried men safely beyond the atmosphere. When he died in 1971, the local paper devoted 3 sentences to him. Robert J. Millikan, 64, chemist and aviation researcher, contributed to early high-altitude oxygen systems. No mention of the explosions, the Pacific firestorms, or the fragile genius that had made the B-29 untouchable. Yet, in the wider world, his legacy lingered everywhere whenever a jetliner pierced the stratosphere, whenever an astronaut exhaled into a closed loop of engineered air. Even now, engineers who study high-altitude physiology trace their oxygen lineage to those wartime prototypes. They cite the same fundamental equation Millikan refined in 1943, balancing partial pressure against metabolic demand. It is still called, unofficially, the Millikan ratio. At 33,000 feet, a pilot can remove his mask, breathe comfortably, and look down on clouds the way the first B-29 crews once did, half in awe, half in disbelief. The air that fills his lungs is perfectly measured, invisible, and utterly tame. He will never know that its stability was born from catastrophe. And that is perhaps the truest monument a scientist can have. Not a statue, not a citation, but the quiet endurance of his work, hidden, reliable, taken for granted. Above the Pacific, jet contrails cross like white scars, fading into blue. They mark no targets now, carry no bombs, only passengers and dreams. Yet somewhere within those clouds, the same chemistry still hums, liquid oxygen turning to breath, the echo of one man's dangerous invention, still feeding life where there should be none. In that invisible exchange between fire and air, the war finally ends, over and over again. Every single day humanity takes to the sky. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.